My name is Marisol Doyle. Everyone calls me Mary. I'm 34 years old, and I spend my professional life teaching companies how to handle other people's most sensitive information responsibly. I'm a data privacy consultant. I write policies about consent, about who owns an image, about what happens when personal information gets used without permission. 11 days after I lost a pregnancy at 14 weeks, my mother posted my sonogram photo to her parenting page, the one with 80,000 followers, along with 3 paragraphs about my miscarriage, captioned "People need to see this," and she did it before she told me she was going to, before she even told me she'd already done it. I found out from a text message from a college friend that said, "Thinking of you, saw your mom's post. Are you okay?" And I sat on my bathroom floor with my phone in my hand, trying to understand how a woman who raised me had turned the worst night of my life into content before I'd even finished bleeding. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the people who think they know your story best are sometimes the ones who understand it least. If you've ever had something private turned into someone else's audience-building material, this one's for you. Subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because what I eventually found in my mother's business records went back a lot further than one bad decision on one terrible night. I should say, before anything else, that my mother, Bonnie Doyle, didn't start out as the kind of person this story makes her sound like. She built her page, Bonnie and the Brood, back when I was in college, mostly as a way to document my younger brother Caleb's childhood, and vent about the chaos of raising 2 kids alone after my stepfather's first business failed. For years it was small, a few thousand followers, sweet in a low-stakes way, recipes and school project photos and the occasional rant about parent-teacher conferences. I never loved being written about, but I understood it as harmless, the kind of oversharing you forgive, because it comes from someone who loves you clumsily, instead of not at all. The miscarriage happened on a Tuesday night, at home, faster and more physically brutal than anyone had warned me it could be, and my husband Theo drove me to the ER at 11 at night, while I called my mother from the passenger seat, because some instinct, even in that much pain, still reached for her first. She was gentle on the phone that night. I want to be fair about that. She said all the right things, asked if she could come sit with me, cried a little herself. I told her, explicitly, before we hung up, "Please don't post about this. I'm not ready for anyone to know yet." She said, "Of course, honey, of course, this is yours to share or not share." The first contradiction came 4 days later, when my aunt sent condolences referencing details I hadn't told anyone outside my immediate family. The exact week I'd been due, the fact that we'd already picked a name. I asked my mother carefully how Aunt Diane knew any of that. She said she must have mentioned it in the family group chat, forgetting, apparently, that I wasn't in that particular chat, the one that existed specifically for updates about the grandchildren, and that whatever she'd written there had clearly traveled further than a private family thread should have. The first hidden detail arrived the following week, small enough that I almost didn't register its significance at the time. I was scrolling my mother's page, checking, as I sometimes did, whether anything about our family had leaked further than I wanted, and I noticed a sponsored post from 3 weeks earlier, before the miscarriage even happened, for a prenatal supplement brand, my mother writing warmly about supporting the newest addition to the family and thanking the company for their support during this exciting chapter. I hadn't known that post existed. I hadn't consented to being part of any supplement campaign, and buried in the caption, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, was a small disclosure tag, paid partnership, that told me this wasn't just an emotional overshare anymore. It was advertising, and I was, apparently, unpaid inventory in it. The trust shift came from my brother Caleb, of all people the sibling I'd always thought of as checked out, uninterested in family drama, happy to let our mother's oversharing wash past him without comment. He called me 2 days after I found the supplement post, quiet in a way he rarely is, and told me he'd actually messaged Mom 8 months earlier, in writing, after she'd posted about his ADHD diagnosis without asking him first, telling her explicitly that their family content had gone too far, and asking her to run things by both of us before posting anything personal going forward. She'd responded, he said, that she heard him, that she'd be more careful, and then 3 weeks later posted about his diagnosis being managed well now. Thanks for asking, everyone, a small triumphant follow-up that made it sound like the conversation had never happened at all. The personal betrayal landed on a Sunday morning 11 days after the ER visit, when my friend's text arrived with the screenshot. The post was long, written in my mother's warm, practiced voice, the sonogram image I'd texted her privately from the hospital waiting room sitting at the top of it. My actual words from a private message quoted underneath, slightly edited, slightly softened in ways that made the grief read more cinematic and less like the raw, disjointed thing I'd actually typed at 2 a.m. People need to see this, she'd written, because we don't talk about this enough, because my daughter deserves to know she's not alone. I sat on my bathroom floor and read it 4 times before I could stand up, and what I kept returning to wasn't even the exposure itself, as violating as that felt. It was that she'd asked me not to be ready for this, and I'd told her I wasn't, and she'd decided that didn't apply to her. The first real consequence arrived within 48 hours, faster than I expected grief to have any room to breathe. The post had been shared over 6,000 times by the time I saw it. A local news outlet's parenting vertical reached out to my mother for a follow-up interview. And separately, entirely unrelated to any of that, a corporate client I'd been scheduled to deliver a keynote for the following month emailed my firm to say they'd decided to postpone, citing, without much elaboration, some hesitancy given recent visibility around my family circumstances, as though my mother's grief content had somehow made me a liability to a company hiring me to talk about protecting other people's private information. I remember laughing, once, alone in my kitchen, a short, ugly laugh at how precisely the irony had landed. I spent that week fielding messages I never asked for, well-meaning strangers sending prayer hands emojis, and unsolicited advice about fertility supplements. A woman I'd never met commenting on my own personal profile that she'd named her rainbow baby after seeing my story, as though my loss had already become raw material for someone else's narrative before I'd even had a chance to grieve it privately. The unexpected ally arrived by email a week later, from a name I didn't immediately recognize, Farah Newen, who identified herself as my mother's social media business manager, the person who handled her brand partnership contracts and analytics. She wrote, carefully, that she wasn't comfortable with how the past 2 weeks had gone, that she'd flagged concerns internally before the post went up, and had been told it was already scheduled and couldn't be pulled, and that she thought I deserved to understand what she meant by scheduled, because it wasn't the word people usually assumed. I met Farah at a coffee shop 2 towns over from where my mother lived, neutral ground, and she told me, hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from, that the miscarriage post had been queued in the content calendar the same afternoon I'd lost the pregnancy, hours after the ER visit, well before my mother had asked my permission for anything, sitting in draft form with a scheduled publish time for 11 days later, timed, Farah said carefully, to align with a seasonal engagement push the supplement brand had specifically requested around emotional, relatable family content that quarter. She showed me the scheduling software on her laptop, the actual interface, a queue of upcoming posts, stretching 2 months out, color-coded by brand partnership, and there, sitting 3 rows down from a back-to-school promotion, was a draft titled, simply Mary Update, a small red flag icon beside it, that Farah explained was her own internal note, one she'd added the morning after the ER visit, asking whether this needed direct confirmation before publishing. She told me my mother had replied to that flag with a single line, already discussed with her, "It's fine," and Farah, 26 years old and 3 years into her first real job managing someone else's business, hadn't felt she had standing to push harder than that against her boss's own account of a private family conversation. I felt for a few days after that conversation a strange, hollow kind of relief, the false victory that comes from finally having language for something you'd only felt as instinct before. I had proof it hadn't been a spontaneous lapse in judgment born of grief and bad timing. It had been planned, scheduled, aligned with a brand calendar, which meant I wasn't crazy for feeling like my miscarriage had been treated as inventory, because in the most literal sense it had been. I thought for those few days that having the truth named was going to be enough. The second betrayal came from my cousin Renata, who I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years, reaching out after hearing through the family grapevine that I was finally asking questions. She told me gently that my mother had posted about Renata's custody battle 4 years earlier, during the worst months of it, framed as a cautionary tale about co-parenting struggles, without asking, and that when Renata had confronted her, my mother had quietly sent her $800 afterward, unprompted, calling it help with legal fees, in a way that felt, Renata said, less like generosity and more like an apology dressed up as a gift, meant to close the conversation rather than open it. This wasn't one bad night, this was a pattern going back years, with a quiet, informal system of appeasement built underneath it to keep anyone from pushing too hard. The stakes became formally legal the following week. I retained an attorney, a media and privacy specialist named Oliver Bramwell, who'd handled right of publicity cases before, and we sent a formal cease and desist demanding immediate removal of the sonogram image, which I owned the copyright to as the original photographer of my own medical file, along with a broader demand that my name, image, and personal medical history not be used in any future content without written consent. I want to be honest that drafting that letter, watching my own professional language get turned against my mother's business, felt like standing outside my own life, watching a stranger do my job on my behalf. Oliver was careful in that first meeting to walk me through exactly what the copyright claim could and couldn't do. He explained that because I'd taken the sonogram photo myself on my own phone, the copyright was unambiguously mine regardless of who I'd texted it to, which meant a platform takedown request would very likely succeed quickly, probably within days. What it couldn't do, he said, was touch the quoted text from my private message or address the deeper pattern Caleb and Renata had both described, and he asked me, plainly, whether I wanted this to be a narrow fix or the beginning of something larger. I told him I didn't know yet, and he said that was a completely reasonable place to start from. The hidden motive surfaced during a difficult, necessary conversation with my stepfather Russ, who I found in his garage 2 days after the cease and desist went out, quieter than I'd ever seen him. He told me, haltingly, that his contracting business had collapsed almost 3 years earlier, a partnership dispute that had cost him nearly everything, and that Bonnie and the brood, which had started as a hobby, had become in that same window the primary income keeping their household afloat, mortgage payments, Caleb's college tuition, all of it increasingly dependent on brand deals that specifically wanted authentic, emotionally resonant family content. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It did explain in a way that made the whole thing feel sadder instead of simpler, why a woman who'd once posted harmless school project photos had slowly, brand deal by brand deal, learned to treat her family's pain as the product keeping the lights on. The difficult choice arrived with Oliver's next phone call, in which he laid out plainly what pursuing this to its full legal extent could mean. A lawsuit substantial enough to potentially bankrupt the business my parents now depended on for their mortgage, filed by their own daughter, played out in exactly the kind of public forum my mother had built her career inside of. I sat with that for 3 days, turning over what justice was actually supposed to accomplish here, whether I wanted to win in a way that collapsed my parents' entire financial life, or whether there was a version of accountability that didn't require me to become as unsparing with their livelihood as she'd been with my grief. The hidden history came from Caleb, who remembered something the rest of us had let slip into the background of family lore, that our grandmother, Bonnie's own mother, had set up a modest trust years before she died, intended, according to the handful of documents Caleb still had copies of from settling her estate, to fund what she'd called a family archive project, a small fund meant to preserve and eventually pass down family stories and photographs to her grandchildren. When Bonnie's page had grown large enough to incorporate as an LLC 6 years earlier, she'd folded that trust's remaining assets into the business's initial capital and buried in the trust's original language, which Caleb finally located in a storage unit that weekend, was a specific clause requiring that any commercial revenue generated using images or stories of the grandchildren root a fixed percentage into a fund held for those same grandchildren's future benefit. Caleb read me the clause over the phone, twice, because neither of us quite believed what we were hearing the first time. Our grandmother, a woman who'd spent her whole life running a small bakery and had never owned a computer that I could remember, had apparently anticipated something like this decades before it happened, or at least anticipated the general shape of it, family stories eventually becoming valuable enough that someone might be tempted to keep that value for themselves instead of passing it forward. Caleb said, half laughing, half something closer to grief, that Grandma Ruth had built us a safety net before any of us knew we'd eventually need one, and I thought about my own father's protective trust clause in an entirely different context, and wondered, not for the first time, how many families are quietly protected by a grandparent's foresight long before anyone in the next generation understands why it was necessary. The power shift came from that clause, which gave Caleb and me actual legal standing, independent of any privacy claim, to formally demand an accounting of 6 years of the LLC's finances against the trust's original terms. Oliver was more energized by this discovery than by anything in the privacy case itself, because a breach of fiduciary duty tied to a decedent's trust, he explained, carried weight and remedies that a personal cease and desist simply didn't, and because it meant the fight was no longer only about my grief, it was about years of unaccounted obligation to every grandchild whose childhood had funded that business, including ones not yet born. The desperate counter-move arrived exactly the way Oliver warned it might, in the form of a follow-up post from my mother, 3 days after the accounting demand letter went out, framing herself publicly as a grieving grandmother under legal attack from her own children, soliciting sympathy, and within the caption a link to a legal defense fund. It worked in the short term, the way these things sometimes do. Thousands of comments defending her, calling me ungrateful. A handful of strangers I'd never met, leaving messages on my own professional social profiles, accusing me of being cruel to a woman clearly suffering. I remember reading those comments at midnight and thinking, with a kind of exhausted clarity, that this was the same instinct that had scheduled my sonogram post 11 days out, control the narrative first, and let the truth arrive whenever it was convenient, now aimed at a wider audience because the family one hadn't been enough to contain it. Oliver advised me not to respond publicly at all, and it was some of the hardest professional advice I've ever taken personally, watching thousands of strangers construct a version of me as the villain of a story I hadn't asked to be part of, while the actual facts sat quietly in a folder on Oliver's desk, unreleased, waiting for a process that moves at the speed of documentation instead of outrage. I unfollowed the page entirely that week, not out of protest, just self-preservation, and asked Theo to screenshot anything he thought I genuinely needed to see, rather than let the algorithm decide what reached me next. The evidence that finally closed the last gap came from Farah, who, once the legal defense fund post went up soliciting money from strangers to fight her own former employer's children, decided she was done protecting anyone's version of events but the true one. She sent Oliver 6 years of accounting spreadsheets, screenshots of the trust's original percentage clause, sitting untouched in a folder my mother had apparently never opened again after incorporating, and confirmation that the designated grandchildren's fund had never once received a transfer. Its balance still sitting at the original modest amount for my grandmother's estate, while the business itself had grown into 6 figures of annual brand revenue, built substantially on content about me, Caleb, and this year, a pregnancy that didn't survive. The complete truth landed heavily, the way Oliver had warned me it would, sitting in his office with the spreadsheets spread across the table between us. This hadn't been one grieving mother's terrible lapse in judgment. It had been a decade-long pattern, born initially from real financial desperation, sustained afterward by a business model that quietly rewarded exactly the kind of exposure I'd asked her not to do, and protected the entire time by a trust obligation she'd either forgotten or chosen not to remember, either way leaving 6 years of children's images monetized without a cent of the promised percentage ever routed back to them. The final confrontation happened on my parents' back porch, not the kitchen table this time, because my mother, when I called to arrange it, said she couldn't bear to sit at that table for this conversation, and I let her have that small mercy even as I laid the spreadsheets in front of her. I didn't raise my voice. I told her I understood now why she'd started the mortgage, Russ's business, the fear of losing the house. I told her that understanding it didn't undo 11 days of scheduled grief content, or 6 years of an unmet trust obligation to children who'd never gotten a say in any of it. She tried briefly to reach for the defense she'd used publicly, that people needed to see this, that stories like mine helped other grieving mothers feel less alone, and I let her finish before I asked her the only question I actually needed answered, which was whether she'd have waited for me to be ready if there hadn't been a brand calendar expecting content that quarter. She didn't answer that one directly. The silence that followed it answered it well enough for both of us. She cried, for a long time not the practiced camera-ready version I'd learned to distrust over the past 2 months, but something rawer, and she said, finally, that she'd stopped being able to tell the difference between loving us out loud and needing us to be useful, and that admission, imperfect and incomplete as it was the closest thing to an honest sentence I'd heard from her since this began. The legal and financial consequences settled over the following several months into something proportional rather than destructive. Rather than pursuing the lawsuit to its full business-ending extent, Oliver helped negotiate a formal settlement. An immediate accounting correction restoring the missed trust percentage retroactively into a newly re-established fund held independently for Caleb, me, and any future grandchildren, a binding image and likeness agreement barring any future use of our names, photos, or personal medical history without explicit written consent, and a public correction post, written and approved by me directly rather than my mother's usual voice, clarifying the actual timeline behind the miscarriage post without either sensationalizing it further or protecting anyone from the plain facts. Farah stayed on with my mother's business through the transition, at my mother's request, and somewhat to my surprise, at mine as well, because someone willing to flag a red icon on a scheduling calendar and eventually risk her own job to hand over 6 years of spreadsheets struck me as exactly the kind of person that business needed more of, not less. She helped build, alongside Oliver's settlement terms, an actual written consent policy for the page going forward, something Bonnie and the brood had never had in any formal sense before. Every family member's explicit sign-off required before their name or image appeared in anything sponsored, a small structural safeguard built, ironically, out of the same instinct my own career had always been built around. The emotional justice, when it finally arrived, looked less like triumph and more like a long exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding for months. I didn't destroy my parents' household. I didn't get the apology tour, the tearful reconciliation storyline my mother's followers might have wanted if they'd been shown any of this. What I got instead was structural, a fund now actually protecting the childhoods it was always supposed to protect, an enforceable boundary around my own image that no financial pressure could quietly erode again, and quietly for myself the decision to write my own account of what happened, not for my mother's 80,000 followers, but as a short essay I published under my own name, on my own terms, months later, once I was actually ready, saying only what I wanted said and nothing anyone else had scheduled in advance. The final quiet revelation came this spring, going through the same storage unit Caleb had found the trust documents in, when I opened a small cedar box that had belonged to my grandmother and found a handwritten journal I'd never known existed, pages of stories about her own childhood, recipes, small unremarkable memories she'd apparently been collecting for years with the specific intention, she wrote on the inside cover, of giving her grandchildren something true to hold on to someday, not for anyone else to see, just for us. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for a long time, holding a version of the exact idea my mother's business had once been built to honor, before habit and desperation and 80,000 strangers had slowly turned it into something else entirely, and I understood, finally, what the archive project had actually been meant to protect all along. That's my story. One scheduled post, one buried trust clause, and 11 days it took me to understand exactly what my grief had been worth to someone else's engagement numbers. If this reminded you that your story is yours to tell, on your own timeline, in your own words, take that as your sign to protect it. Share this with someone who's ever had their pain turned into someone else's content. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.